Story time. When my daughter was about 8 years old, she was getting ready to play soccer for the first time. She was so excited because all of her friends were going to be playing, and she couldn't wait to go out and gather all of the things she needed for soccer: shoes, pink socks, pink shin guards, all the accoutrements that are required to play soccer. So we had quite the afternoon out gathering these things, and she was so excited. That night, we were laying on the couch watching a movie, and all of a sudden, she starts to cry and then sob. I said, "Baby, what's wrong?" And she said, "I don't know how to play soccer." And was in that moment refusing to even go to the practice because she couldn't fathom that you would show up somewhere not knowing how to do something. And so the uncertainty of she could picture herself in the outfit because we had just bought that, but now she had to picture herself out standing on a soccer field, and the discomfort of not knowing what to do was more than she can handle. That describes how your brain is always trying to fill in the blanks of what comes next. And when we don't know how it's going to go, it causes us to freak out. And you will hear the term imposter syndrome used often, which means I feel like a fraud. And the good news is, if you have encountered the feeling of imposter syndrome, it typically uh, hits people who are really smart and successful. The interesting fact, just like the burnout report, is the women who coined this term, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing those correctly, quite frankly. They did this study in the 70s based on their own experience. Sound familiar? Sound like Herbert Friedenberger from the burnout report that we covered last month? Sure does. It was finally published in 1978, this report that they did on imposter syndrome, where you're feeling like a fraud. And when they surveyed hundreds of women, they uncovered two characteristics. One, those that had an older sibling, specifically a sister, who was the smart one, which meant they were not. So they felt like a fraud. And the second characteristic were parents or being raised in an environment where they were told they were great at everything. And so the sense of failing seemed overwhelming. Well, and because we all fail, you're not going to get away from that. And so what was going to happen when they did, and they felt like a fraud because they were failing but hiding it because their parents had set this expectation that they were perfect. So I go back to the history of work. When we moved into the factory, where everything was about external validation, somebody's going to tell me if I'm good or not. Now I got to measure up. And what if they find out I'm not good because I fail? Because we all fail. And then the most troubling to me is, because things worked so well in the factory, we brought the factory model of work into education. And so there's a strong emphasis on individual achievement, GPA, grades. Did you get the part in the play? Are you on this team? Did the team win the game? Achieving and something that tells me if I'm good. So an outside in perspective versus an inside out. I know who I am. I know I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm going to learn from those mistakes. Sometimes that's the most valuable learning available to us, is what we learned when we failed. But if we're so afraid to try something new because we don't want to fail, we're never going to try something new, and we're never going to learn and level up from that experience. And so I get a little bit concerned when things get labeled like imposter syndrome and burnout and things like that, because people can just go to that and say, well, see, look, I have imposter syndrome. See, look, I have burnout, and allow themselves really just to be a victim of that circumstance instead of rising up to create the life they want in spite of those things. And that's what we're here to do. So I've included a link to an article from the New Yorker that tells the history of Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes in the report and getting it published and where things went from there. But much like Herbert Friedenberger, once you got to the point that social media could carry the message, that's when it blew up. So when people think it's new, shit ain't new either. It's, in my opinion, a factor of this industrial age model of work and school and life that we are, all of us here, are in the process of shifting to the age of humanity. So there you go.